Welcome to the third of our videos of the classical and medieval Britain. In this video, we will be looking at the Anglo-Saxon era. So the Anglo-Saxons invaded in force in 410 AD. So as we discussed previously, the Anglo-Saxons were predominantly from the north of Europe, and they had some historical connections to early Viking settlers. However, by this time, they were distinctly different from the Vikings, and they had their own culture and their own society. They were aware of the British Isles prior to invasion, as some of them had visited the British Isles while serving with the Roman army. So they certainly knew of the natural wealth of the islands, the farmland, the minerals, and the forests. So this knowledge gave them an advantage when it came to the invasion. So at this time, the Romans were leaving the British Isles to defend other parts of their territory in Europe, and the islands themselves were much changed from when the Romans arrived hundreds of years ago. So the Roman Empire itself was having troubles with invasions from other people in different parts of Europe. They decided not to stay in the British Isles. They decided to concentrate on mainland Europe itself. So in 410 AD, the British Isles were made up of a mixture of many nationalities. So this includes the Romans that stayed, the early Britons that were originally there, and there were also many people from the Roman Empire who settled there. So they had established cities and trading areas, and the British Isles were relatively peaceful up to this point. So when the Romans left, the Anglo-Saxons saw an opportunity to conquer and take the islands for themselves. So they landed with a large army, and they quickly overcame the defenders of the British towns. The defenders themselves did not expect an attack, and really they had always relied on Roman protection. Of course, the Romans were now gone, as was this protection. Like with the Roman invasion, many people resisted the Anglo-Saxons at the beginning, and it was a violent and a difficult time. Unlike the Romans, the Anglo-Saxons were seen as more wild, more barbaric compared to the Romans. So many people feared that life under the Anglo-Saxons would be sort of like going in the past. So they were an unknown people, and people didn't want to go back to a life when it was just tribal wars. As well as the Anglo-Saxons, other groups also wanted to take the land in the British Isles. So there were many raids that took place, especially from the Vikings. Really, everyone took advantage of the Romans leaving. It was seen as an easy target for conquest. So many of the legends and the stories from the British Isles came from this time. The legend of King Arthur and Excalibur, this came from this time, and King Arthur himself was said to have fought the early Anglo-Saxon invaders. He was said to be an early Briton, and his advisor, Merlin, Merlin came from a kind of old Briton myth. Eventually, the Anglo-Saxons conquered most of the British Isles, and despite the attacks by the Vikings and other raiders, they decided to divide the land into 7 distinct kingdoms. And this was based on who were the strongest fighters and leaders who were in Britain at that time. They would each get a different region. So the seven kingdoms were divided into these. The first was Kent, and the second was Mercia. The third was Northumbria. The fourth was East Anglia. The fifth was Essex. The sixth was Sussex. And the seventh was Wessex. So these seven kingdoms lasted for a few hundred years. They lasted due to uneasy alliances with each other, and sometimes there were disputes. But all throughout this, the Anglo-Saxons had to deal with raiders and fighting amongst the kingdoms. The Vikings themselves were especially a problem to the rulers. They would often attack by the rivers and the seas, and this caused the Anglo-Saxons to build fortifications of river towns. The kingdom of Wessex emerged as the strongest of the kingdoms, and by the 9th century, the King of Wessex had some very ambitious ideas. He wanted to unite the seven kingdoms under one ruler and one king. Of course, this was not easy to do, and it took several years before it could even be possible. So the first thing the Wessex family had to deal with was to make themselves powerful enough and famous enough that the other kingdom's rulers would agree to unite under the one king. This came when King Alfred of Wessex defeated a powerful Viking attack, and afterwards he was considered a very strong ruler. He was known as Alfred the Great. So the Wessex family now had the fame and the popularity to begin to unite the kingdoms, and the unification process began. So eventually in 927 AD, his grandson, who was named Athelstan, became the first ruler of all the kingdoms. This united kingdom was known as England. So the seven kingdoms became one, and that one was known as England. So King Athelstan himself was a fairly wise ruler, and the new England was kept together for many years. At this time, there were borders with in between it that were respected, and trade and currency that were circulated around. King Athelstan and his descendants, his family, ruled until 1066. So this period of time we can see as a kind of golden age in English history, as the country was united for really the first time. So in summary, it's important to understand the distinction between the Romans and the Anglo-Saxons. In terms of how they occupied, the Romans really only wanted to expand their existing territory and create a type of colony for the greater Roman Empire. The Anglo-Saxons themselves were willing to entirely relocate to the British Isles and set up a permanent kingdom, a home that they were 100% committed to and defending against invaders. So when the Romans left, many groups wanted to conquer, the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons especially, but really only the Anglo-Saxons had the numbers and the commitment to settle the islands. They had the knowledge of agriculture, which is a kind of method of farming, and a leadership style to repel other invaders. In fact, the borders or the boundaries between the Anglo-Saxon leaders, the seven kingdoms, define the areas of England that are really still used today.